So yeah, to start our gathering tonight, I want to acknowledge that the Climate Justice Organizing Hub and myself included are coming to you tonight from the territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka, who are the keepers of the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So this land, this island that I'm on, called colonially Montreal, is known as Tiohtià:ke in Kanien'kehá:ka, which is a language of the Iroquoian family, and has historically, this place that I'm in has historically over thousands and thousands of years and continues to be this really vibrant meeting place for many, many indigenous nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka. And so, yeah, I wanted to, in gathering us here today, to talk about conflict, to talk about the harm that it can cause, to think through what it means to weave what we learned today into the climate justice organizing work we want to do, and with decolonial approaches to said work. So someone who is an incredible elder and advisor to the Hub, Ellen Gabriel, has shared in many different ways, but one of them is an interview in which she talks about what it means to go beyond land acknowledgements, to go beyond the purely symbolic and into the material and concrete. And so, yeah, we can share at the end of this webinar some more tools and resources that Ellen points us to go deeper in this work. But I want to, yeah, ground us there as we move through this content and think about how this can all be tied together towards just and decolonial futures. Yeah, with that, I will move to what I gestured towards earlier, that this is a two-part series. So this first offering will be all about how we can create the skills necessary and approaches to avoid preventable conflict and build skills for conflict transformation. In the second workshop, we're going to go even deeper into what those practical tools for conflict transformation, what they can look like, how you can use them, and that there are so many at our disposal, which is really empowering and exciting when we come towards this kind of work that can feel really overwhelming. So we'd love for you to join us next week as well, but we also will be recording it, so we'll be sending out both at the end of both workshops. And with that, we will start. So to start us off, what is conflict and why does it matter? I'm going to pass to Amanda.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Move to the next slide. So there are lots of definitions of conflict that you'll find in different resources. This is one that we've found helpful because it's quite expansive and gets to kind of the breadth of types of tensions and things that can come up. So Luna NH describes conflict as being inclusive of any situation where there is incongruence, misalignment, disagreement, disruption, dissent, or tension. And it's not doesn't necessarily involve harm, violence, or discomfort. And I will note in this workshop, we're not discussing conflict that does escalate to the point of violence or harm. That's beyond the scope of this workshop. And conflict can sometimes be joyful and exciting and involve growth and learning and still require support or processes to reach the desired goals and outcomes of all of the people involved. Another quote here, this comes from the African-American feminist and activist Loretta Ross, who has done a lot of work in the reproductive justice movement in the US, and also thinking about conflict in movement spaces. And she talks about how a group of people who are all thinking the same thing and moving in the same direction, that would be described as a cult, a little bit playfully there. But a group of people who are thinking different things and still moving in the same direction, that's a movement. And that's what we're trying to foster in this workshop and in other work.
So we'd like to pass it to you. Amanda's going to put in the chat a link to our slides today, and we'd love for you to answer this question, preferably on the sticky notes we've got provided on the Google Slides, but if you want, you could do so in the chat. In your experience, what factors have sort of contributed to underpinned conflict in your organizing, in the grassroots spaces that you're in? What are the considerations and factors you've seen at play when conflict has erupted? We'd love to hear from you, and we'll give you 2 minutes to sort of jot down some preliminary thoughts. And if you see something in the sticky notes that like resonates with you, we've got in the top right a bunch of little stars that you can drag and drop to answers that you resonate with. If you want to add a little like +1, like, yes, this is something I've seen as well. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of movement. One more minute. Lots of typing. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for sharing. Awesome. So yeah, as people keep populating this, thank you so much. I'm seeing folks writing about ableism, competition and scarcity sort of coming up in regards to maybe funding. Lots of things about fears, about divergence in approaches. I'm seeing in the chat as well, people who maybe people who maybe have the same goals but have different ways to like get there, or different like micro goals. So like there's a lot of like contention, like Amanda was saying with that first quote there, like that tension between things, people feeling threatened, or there really being a premium put on wanting to get along and like everything be, you know, hunky-dory, but then actually maybe that getting in the way of growth, or actually having harder conversations that, you know, are hard and hard to face, but then actually on the other side of those hard conversations are the things we want to get to, right? The things we need to surface and we need to move through. Yeah, seeing so many, yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Like, we're seeing so many things. As we can see, there's a lot that can contribute to tension and conflict. I might just call on like one or two people. Would anyone like to speak a little bit more to their point? If you'd like to put up your hand, or drop a star in the chat to speak a bit more to your experience. Cool. We're a bit of a quiet crowd tonight. That's okay. Then we will move on to the next slide, which like really brings in so much of what people have already surfaced here, which is really cool to see. So as activists, we all really are painfully aware of the fact that we are in conflict with systems of oppression. Capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, ableism, sexism, unfortunately, the list goes on. And that these systems and the systems we're in conflict with are not easy to take down. And this can make sense. Then we will have sort of disagreements on how best to approach dismantling and fighting for systems change, as well as the systems are set themselves will influence our own internal dynamics, how we do the work, how we are with one another. So what we've seen from Amanda and I's perspective is that conflict can escalate to the point of crisis when there are a combination of factors at play. Like we saw in the last slide with what folks are sharing, there are so many ways all these things, unfortunately, and in very toxic ways, can interrelate, inform one another and become really calcified and really like strong factors that drive conflict. So in this diorama or diagram, we have sort of in the middle, the blue squares or the blue circles, sorry, are all the sort of things that are within our groups that can percolate to the surface, right? That can create conflict. So you've got decision making, maybe disagreeing on how we make decisions, how we structure ourselves, how we communicate, the way that trauma informs all of these things as well, and so many other things that are related with power dynamics and oppression. And then we have some of the factors external to our organization, that can, bear on to these other factors as well that are outside our orgs, but then structure what happens internally are these purple circles, right? Ideas of competitiveness, urgency culture, fear of others, and also maybe hyper-individualism can also interact in really toxic ways with these other dynamics and get us, divided and not able to move through conflict in meaningful and productive ways.
Yeah, so I'll start by drawing your attention to this really beautiful, wonderful book that has informed so much of my thinking called Let This Radicalize You by Kelly Hayes and Mariame Kaba. They talk about in their work how we have a long history in movements of doing conflict resolution, doing grief work, doing healing work, and that this has always mattered. And we can root ourselves a little bit in that knowledge that we're not the first to do this. There's nothing like shameful or wrong in the fact that we're grappling with conflict. It's actually a good thing, a healthy thing, and it has been part of our movement history for a long time. And thinking too in this context of climate crisis, at the Hub, we're thinking about climate justice as crises intensify, as natural disasters intensify, as overlapping social economic crises escalate, the possibility for conflict also increases because we're under more stress, we're under just difficult circumstances. So it's all the more important to be talking about and building conflict skills. And they have this really beautiful way of framing a social movement as being more than just a labor force for social justice. It also functions as an ecosystem that encompasses things like care, learning, relationship building, and action. And that's a bit of what we'll be trying to surface in this workshop. So yeah, our focus today is really on laying some practices to prevent what we're calling destructive conflict and lay the groundwork for generative conflict. So this quadrant diagram here comes from a group called Conflict Transformation. And so you'll see on the right side where we have these two types of conflict. Conflict indicates that there's some sort of change that's desired, and it's an opportunity for change. The top quadrant with the generative conflict is conditions that are moving towards life. They're life affirming, they're liberatory. We're moving towards a change in a way that meets people's needs, that allows for maybe greater understanding, vulnerability within set containers. Whereas destructive conflict, you can see on the bottom part there, conditions are moving towards being more life-taking, life-threatening, oppressive. And then on the other side, on the left, these two other boxes, no conflict and atrophy, that shows that a change isn't being desired. Maybe there's actually an effort to maintain something. And that could be good. That could be there's no conflict. We're moving along. We've got our strategy. We've got our campaign. We're just moving along nicely. But this bottom quadrant here of atrophy kind of represents stagnation or degeneration. And I think it's nice to draw attention here that if there's no conflict, that isn't necessarily. It could be a sign that something's missing. That we're missing out on some kind of change that isn't being surfaced. Yeah, we can move forward.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about structural and cultural factors today. Those are like the two kind of guiding sections of the rest of the workshop. And we're going to start with structural factors when it comes to conflict. And what can we do when we name these factors, and what can we do to be better at them so that we can hopefully avoid or prevent conflict when possible, or avoid preventable conflict, and then also mitigate it, right, when it does happen. So, and so much of this is about forethought. It's about thinking about, okay, when we are in conflict, when conflict arises, what are the kind of things that we have at our disposal? How can we how can we build structures today, build processes today, build skills and instincts today that can help or prevent conflict tomorrow? So for example, really important things when we're thinking about preventing avoidable conflict really boils down to creating an organization of care, of learning, and of alignment. So what does it mean to, prevent conflict by having really good structure, which is easy to say and another thing to do, but really thinking about the structures we have in place in regards to decision making, in terms of group assessments and accountability. So that could be, having a clear mission statement, a community agreement, vision statements, that sort of thing that guide your work, that you can come back to, that everyone's agreed on, you can come back to and ground you in the way you move forward. Optimizing team structure, thinking about decision making in really intentional ways, and then thinking about when you do actions or events, how do you evaluate ahead of time for, thinking about what potential challenges and potential failures you could face, and how can you proactively kind of move through and solve for them in advance so that we don't have conflict or these avoid success in beforehand, right? So how can we think about things ahead of time? So yeah, if you're interested in diving more into group structure, we'll talk about a few things in the rest of this workshop, but group structure per se, or specifically on that topic, we have a workshop all about it. So we'd love for you to keep your eyes peeled for that. But otherwise, yeah, we're going to dive into what you can optimize and think about when you're thinking about group structure in regards to conflict. So in terms of team structure, something really key that feels really simple and kind of like a no-brainer is to think about who is on the team, right? And making that really clear to everyone who's involved. It can be hard when your group has a lot of turnover, which is like really a really common pitfall in grassroots groups. There's lots of people whose capacities change all the time, given so many different factors in the world. But really making it clear and having structures in place that make sure people know, okay, who's on the team, that the team remains relatively stable for long enough that you can develop sort of internal processes, internal sort of communication practices, as well as strategy and other things, which will just kind of, which will happen and can be fostered over time by care, by relationship building, by deep listening, and a lot of these other important skills. You also want to have a team that has like a clear and compelling purpose. If people don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it, it's not, that's sort of grounds for people leaving you and they're having a lot of turnover, but also for conflict because there's, people can't agree. There isn't something that brings you all together in a clear way on what you're trying to achieve as a goal. And then third, having explicit norms and a process for self-correction and kind of accountability when things maybe go a little bit sideways so that you're all on the same page about what do we do when we come to a roadblock? What do we do when a conflict happens? How can we agree ahead of time on what that could look like? So having norms is really important, especially in diverse teams of all kinds, because working across race, age, disability, class, etc., is really, really important for our movements because we want to work across difference. We want to build power and solidarity, but that can also, we want to be really aware of and make sure we do the work of being thoughtful, being anti-racist, being anti-oppressive, and making sure we're not reproducing those systems of harm in our teams themselves as we fight for better worlds. So yeah, all of these things are really important to think about in terms explicitly about team structure so that you can build teams that people want to stay on, that people want to do the work of repair when conflict comes up, and that you can move together as one towards your shared goals.
Yeah, so this is kind of interrelated with structure, but a lot of conflict is actually related to decision making. There's the Venn diagram of the two, there's a lot of overlap between decision making and conflict. And something I've found in my experience too is oftentimes a disagreement that might seem to be about the outcome is actually about the process and how you made the decision. So kind of just surfacing here that we make decisions all the time in everyday life implicitly, and we use different kinds of decision-making models and processes, although we don't always give it a formal name. It's not like something we're thinking about actively, but we do that when I'm making a decision with my husband about what to cook for dinner, or when I decide what to put on this, like what to wear, or when I decide like where I want to go out for dinner with a group of 4 friends. And sometimes we can just get into a habit of like doing something the way that feels natural to us. But when we're in a group setting, maybe some other people have like a different way that they normally make decisions in a group. So getting clarity on the decision-making process, again, it sounds so simple, but it's so important. Clarity really helps with conflict. Agreeing on a clear decision-making approach can really prevent a lot of pitfalls and enhance collaboration. Maybe put like a star in the chat if this is something that you would be interested in hearing more about, because we are thinking of doing a future workshop on just decision making. But we can move to the next slide. Yeah, I'll just say this really briefly to kind of give you that menu of options of like, I make a decision on my own. That's like an autocratic decision, or we're gonna like wait and see. That would be an avoidant decision. Consensus, which is a pretty common decision-making model in many grassroots groups. Consent is something that is sometimes discussed in conversation with consensus. There's a slight difference between everyone agreeing and no one objecting. Sometimes there's a group that makes a decision and consults other people. Sometimes you delegate. Some groups might have a culture of voting on things. There are some things that maybe you just flip a coin. So there's many ways to make decisions, and just kind of having awareness of that can help you think about the different ways that decisions get made in the world. And I will put a link, we have a link at the very end of this workshop on some frameworks you can use to think through decision making, like Darcy, which is something that helps with thinking about consulting, who's consulted, who's a decision maker, who's accountable, and also something else called FIST to 5, which is an easy way to kind of gauge consensus within a meeting. So that'll be at the end of our slide deck. Yeah, and so a lot of conflicts can reflect like a mismatch in the desired decision-making process. Maybe you have like your preferred method that like you didn't know it was called consent, but that's typically how you like to make a decision, and someone else maybe has a more autocratic style. And if there's that mismatch, that can lead to tension and conflict. So uncovering that can help make future decision-making run a lot smoother. And you can use different models for different situations. We don't have to be super glued to one model. We can be practical about it as long as we're having conversations about meeting people's needs. We can blend models, and then facilitation is always very important in the context of a group decision. The conversation that leads to the final decision is often the most important part, and that's where we can really be intentional about being inclusive and participatory and transparent in facilitation and communication.
Yeah. And sort of our last couple 3 things to think about in terms of structural, sort of proactive things you can do and sort of put in place to mitigate or avoid preventable conflict are pre-mortems as well as before and after action reviews. So if you're new to this kind of frameworks, basically a pre-mortem is a tool you can use that's kind of from the project management, that you can use before you launch a project. So this could be anything from something really small with your group or like something bigger like a campaign, to initially surface fears, create a space where the group, sits down and chats about what are the things you're worried about, what are the things that we can problem solve for now so that we can avoid them later. Before action reviews and then after action reviews are also a set of tools that can be used to practice sort of creating a space of learning, of accountability, of reflection, and sort of self-assessment within your group so that you can learn as you do. And continue that sort of fostering that kind of community, that sort of dialogue, that sort of vulnerability as you move through things, actions and things you're doing as a group, so you can become better and better at them and also build relationships through those processes, right? Which will help you when it comes to conflict. Because it's really hard to be in conflict, or it becomes harder or it brings its own attendant challenges when you're in conflict with someone you don't know very well, if there's no trust there already, that can really erode there ever being a road back to finding something, that works for everyone. So in terms of all three of these, starting with the pre-mortem process, this is basically an imagination exercise, right? That you work back from potential anxieties, potential flaws you see in the program, or failures that could happen. So you basically work back from imagining if you failed at something, right, as a group. It could be, let's say, a campaign launch event. If we were to fail, what would have caused that failure, right? So to think before it happens, what could create that failure, and then reflect as a group. There'll be like several rounds of reflections, so you can share your top reason for failure, how to reduce the risk of said failure, and then how can we try and experiment to avoid or mitigate that risk of failure, given what we've surfaced today. So it really is, this community building thing, this relationship building thing, and also this accountability building exercise that helps you as a group think through, all the way, like play the tape all the way to the end, think about what could potentially go wrong, and then plan for it and sort of proactively solve for it. That can really help with getting rid of, conflicts later of, oh, you didn't do this, or this didn't work well, or like, things getting blamey and negative and really devolving. And then second, we've got the before action review process, which you can use for, smaller kind of actions themselves. So before starting it, being like, what is the intended action or result we want from this? How are we going to measure success? A couple other questions there. You can discuss in different sort of formats. So starting with, again, like a reflection on your own, and then opening it up slowly to the group for more discussion. And this, again, also promotes accountability, reflection, and listening, which is really key when you're coming at conflict. And then finally, after an action is concluded as a group, debriefing is so key. So many times you can be tired after an action, you can be really, you really pushed really hard to make something happen and get everything together, things at the last minute were like a lot of bandwidth and work and energy zapping. But it's really key to debrief things as a team, because that creates a sense of collectivity, again, that's really important, of self-assessment. And it creates this culture of learning that you really want to keep going and creating and fostering, because as conflicts come up, if you've already created this container and this practice of, trying to proactively solve for conflict or failure, and then also after something happens, having a culture of debriefing and trying to understand what went wrong so you could avoid it next time. Those are all going to be skills that you can add together and, create a really good conditions for the conflict transformation process to be successful, because trust is going to be so important. Relationships are going to be at the heart of all organizing, but especially when you're getting into navigating conflict. Yeah, and with that, I know we've thrown a bunch of structural things at you to consider. So we'd love to take 5 minutes to maybe let you have a bio break if you need some water, to go to the washroom, to do a little stretch. We'll come back at 42 past the hour, wherever you're at. And then we're going to dive into cultural factors you should take into consideration in order to prevent avoidable conflict. Otherwise, also, we'd love to answer questions that have come up as well. Yeah. All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to come back slowly.
Maybe tell us what you did during the break in the chat so we know you're back.
I found out my cat was like chewing on a Velcro shoe. So that was fun. Yeah, gotta check on the floor cats. Got some coffee. All right. All right.
Late for coffee, wow. Caught up on your note taking.
Nice. Yeah, at least where I am, I would need an iced coffee if I was gonna have a coffee. It is hot in so-called Montreal. Yeah. Not sure about the baby bell. Interesting. Little animals? I don't know. Um, cool. Well, let's dive back in. So we want to talk about the second part of today's workshop. I know there's so much that we talked about in the first half that like deserves so much more time. But if any of that's interesting to you, like we can absolutely like we want to be doing more workshops on those things, like Amanda said, and then also we offer more coaching and support if you're ever in need of figuring out how to integrate this stuff into your work. So you can always reach Amanda and I at our emails. We'll drop at the end of this workshop in the chat, but also it's in the slides. But yeah, with that, let's launch into cultural factors. So we're going to get our brains running again with another little activity. So if you could join us on slide 25 or in the chat. This one might, at first, you're like, what do you mean cultures? But we want to ask the question, what cultures have influenced your way of life? What sort of interacts with how you show up in the world and informs how you show up in the world? Because we know that so many different factors in our lives obviously contribute to and are a part of who we are. And we're always constantly shaped by these cultural waters we're swimming in, right? And they can really have a huge bearing on how we show up in conflict or not. So these could be, I don't know, religious, racial, artistic, spiritual, whatever you like. Basically, what has shaped you culturally, we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, we'll give you 2 minutes to do a little jotting. Yeah, so seeing a lot about white supremacy culture for sure, and how much that has been, yeah, such a shaping and really like strong and overpowering oppressive force in people's lives. Um, Judgment, not recognizing diversity of experience or nuance. Yeah, that there being some cultures of maybe being closed-minded and judging and negative. The separation of body and mind, yeah, that sort of artificial and false binary. Internalized, lots of urgency tonight, like people talking a lot about internalized capitalism and urgency culture really shaping them and yeah, really keeping us, I think, in a really stressed out place where we can't fully be our full selves, obviously, that we're diminished, that we're made small by that urgency, that we're not able to have the expansiveness necessary to make, full decisions. Yeah, and also so many different folks talking a bit more about their parentage or their lineage and where they're coming from and how that's really shaped them. But then also some anti-capitalist stuff too, like punk and anarchist communities, queer cultures, all these wonderful, really lively alternatives as well. So there being a lot of different forces at play. And yeah, I want to join us for the second part of this question on the next slide, which is what comes to mind when you think of organizing culture, and how that's shaped you, or how you've, what you've seen when you've entered into sort of organizing spaces. Are there maybe overlaps? Are there ways in which it's different or the same? We'd love to hear from you. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing a bit of slowing down, so I'll pass to Amanda to take the torch from here.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so definitely some overlap between the two slides, but also it's nice to see some people have had good experiences in organizing culture too. I've seen things like community care, self-care, vulnerability, but also things like burnout, lack of self-care, difficulty slowing down, punishment. Someone in the chat is saying organizing culture is the greatest challenge as the right is designed to prey on our differences, use our injuries to divide and conquer. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot packed into these two prompts we've done, and kind of part of why we wanted to have you think about culture both in the world outside of organizing and in organizations and grassroots movement work, is to begin to think about culture as something dynamic. So sometimes when we think about culture like outside in the world, there can sometimes be, this is kind of an outdated idea, but you might still hear people think of like, oh, like Canadian culture or Indian culture, like that's just the way it is, like it can't be changed. It's really ingrained. But we know from like social science research that that's really not true. Like cultures are dynamic, they do change. They have always changed. And yeah, culture like generally refers to like the shared beliefs, behaviors, customs, values, and assumptions that like characterize a group of people, and that could be a group of people organizing or a group of people, in a queer community, or who are bounded by geography and ethnicity. There's many different ways to think of culture, and shared experience is a big part of what kind of helps build culture. And culture as dynamic, I think it's, in my experience, has been easier to think about it as dynamic in grassroots spaces because they are so kind of, there's a lot of turnover. And so I've like witnessed firsthand sometimes how a culture can change very quickly just with the changes in leadership. Um, and that's neither good nor bad. It's just a thing, it's a statement. But it helps to think about culture as also something that we make, right? People make and define culture. And that can mean that like, if you're struggling right now in your group, feeling that the culture is really unhealthy, the good news is that it can be improved. But also if you're feeling that the culture that you're in your group right now is like really great, it can also very easily be overtaken or deteriorate. So that's just something to keep in mind as like, it's dynamic, it's alive, but it's also kind of a shared responsibility, and leaders in groups play a really important role in modeling the kind of culture and way of moving that we want to foster. But thinking about it still as a collective responsibility. So there's modeling and leadership, but ultimately we all participate in culture and make it together. Yeah, you can move.
Yeah, exactly. So having and like creating and then maintaining a healthy, grounded, and empowering organizational culture is really key to the work that we want to do, to being effective, but then also the moral imperative of being good to each other, right? And that this work, like Amanda's saying, is so dynamic and really requires a lot of continuous dynamic work in return. So this could look like, staying clear on your vision and your mission statement, kind of coming back to it at, stated intervals, agreed upon intervals, to make sure, okay, are we still living up to the principles we've all set for each other? Reviewing community agreements. So that could be maybe, again, whatever interval works for you, but maybe at a monthly gathering, to make sure that, like, the way that we're showing up with the norms and other cultural aspects of our work is really in line and in keeping with the way we want to be in our groups and in the world. And yeah, something that can be a part of that community agreement is, how do we move through conflict? What is the sort of infrastructure, which we'll talk a bit about next week, or the process or the ways that we approach conflict as a group, instead of it happening and then kind of taking everyone by surprise. So we have an example community agreement here. We really do think that having something to come back to and ground yourselves in, something that has been co-created as a group and that you perennially and consistently come back to and keep affirming and agreeing to, can be a really awesome way to set the ground for your group, to make sure you're all on the same page. And if something is like, people aren't sure about how to move with or like kind of react to a certain thing that's come up in a group, either in a dynamic or a decision or what have you, that you can use it as this tool to ground you in the decisions you use moving forward. So you don't have to constantly be relitigating the ground on which you're all working from. So yeah, just sort of generally, what are the values that we strive to live up to? And then what are the practices that make those values, lived in our group experience, that we actually embody them and that we actually carry them forward? So there's lots of different really cool ideas, like from Spring Up and other groups, about how to do that work of articulating this agreement.
Yeah, so tell me in the chat if you've ever been in a group that like spent a lot of time about coming up with their group agreements, and then they just like sit in the Google Drive and like we forget about them, and new members like maybe don't know they exist. And before you know it, we're like not living up to our community agreements at all. Has anyone else had that experience? Or is it just me? Yes, okay. So this is a little bit work for you, because I'm curious what you're all gonna say is like, how can we keep our community agreements alive in day-to-day organizing? So we can take a few minutes to think about actions that you already are doing, ways to kind of do that modeling work. Yeah. Yes, reviewing it with volunteers. So making the community, I love that in the chat, like make it part of your onboarding process. I'm gonna paste over some of the ones from the chat. Have them posted during the meeting. Okay, put these. Wow, so many great ideas here. Okay, I'll read out a few. So we have things like seasonal reviews following a cycle, spring, summer, etc. Reviewing community agreements with volunteer leaders. Moving forward, let me see. Every meeting, have them posted during the meeting for review. I saw someone else had said like maybe reading one of them each meeting, so it becomes like a practice you don't have to do the whole thing, but you get in the habit of remembering them. Personal check-ins, vibe checker, challenging professionalism, rechecking agreements at a certain frequency, starting the meetings with a land acknowledgement, keeping up with the learning. Yeah, these are all so great. Yeah, and I've found definitely in my experience, I've been in some groups where it's like we have some of these practices and then like we let them slide and then conflict happens and then we're like, oh, right, we should do that again. And then we bring it back again and then we let it slide. So sometimes it's just like kind of, it can feel like, oh, we don't need to do this, we figured it out. But especially in a group when new people are coming, it can be really important to just kind of build that into your practice. Okay, still some writing, that's great. A steward for the agreements. Reminding people that we can revise and adapt, for sure. It's not set in stone. And if we revise and find that like something isn't working or we've like grown beyond something, we've like learned new things since the time of writing it, and we want to kind of reflect that in our agreements. Yeah. Okay. You want to move to the next? Right. Okay, so yeah, there is a lot of, I should say too, I meant to say this earlier, there's a lot of overlap between structure and culture. We've divided them this way, but like things like norms, which we talked about in structure, can also be part of culture and vice versa. But a big part of what we're trying to think about in the culture section is building the skills that you're going to need in a heated conflict before you're in that heated conflict. And like start really like practice them as a preventative practice and get into the habit of them. So that it feels like more normal and less scary to do when the stakes are a little bit higher. And people are like a little more on edge or, you know, in that heated situation. So some of the conflict skills that you're really going to need and that you can practice today are deep and active listening, talking about our feelings, some of which we already kind of mentioned in previous exercises, like the pre-mortem or the before and action review, surfacing fears, anxieties, but also hopes, like positive emotions. Those are good to talk about, gratitude. Getting comfortable like making mistakes and learning from them and building that learning into, you know, the next iteration, and building deep relationships. And there's this phrase here from a wonderful workbook, In It Together, from the Dragonfly Collective. It says, we soften the fabric, but we make the weave strong. So all of this work, it makes our group stronger. So it's worthwhile. Okay, so this also comes, yeah, I'm just reading the chat too. Being vulnerable is hard and difficult for many. For sure, a good leader is vulnerable and willing to be open to building deep relationships. Okay, so this comes also from Kelly Hayes and Mariam Kaba's book. It might seem really obvious, but it's really important. So I'm just going to go through this step by step. But relationships and assumptions, we don't build relationships by making assumptions about other people. I think that it can sound really obvious, like, of course, but once you can like get really involved in like an activist group, it's like really, I have found in my experience, it can be easy to like get really caught up in like one way of doing things or like one kind of particular path, and then kind of have maybe like skepticism or less ease with people who don't immediately like think or do things that way. So as much as possible, like approaching relationships with curiosity rather than assumptions, avoiding presuming things about other people and engaging in open dialogue. Also fostering active listening. Listening is really hard, like patiently and respectfully absorbing someone else's words, listening to understand rather than to react. And I think this is like especially hard nowadays in an environment where there's like so much social media and where so much of our like news and political content is filtered through social media, where algorithms also like really encourage kind of like quick, short, snappy, immediate reactions, and reactions that are just like you read, you react. building that skill of really like sitting with someone's words and considering them deeply can be really hard. But it's a skill that it's underdeveloped and we're going to need it in conflict. Um, and I just wanted to note too that like listening and what active listening looks like for different people, it might not be the same for everyone. So when we're thinking about like our backgrounds, culture, but also like disability, um, maybe if you're like for neurodivergent folks, it might not always be the same kind of level of like direct eye contact. So that's something that if you have that conversation as a team, it can also deepen understanding and avoid misunderstandings and disappointment as well. And yeah, building like a culture of listening um, is just, yeah, like super important to kind of deepen relationships and collaboration. Yeah, okay. So building on that, we wanted to talk about like some examples of like preventative conflict practices. Um, so for instance, you could think about building intentional time and space for checking in on stress, workload, problems and concerns. So these are kind of almost like mini conflict interventions. There might not even be like a conflict yet. It's just like a little simmering tension, but we have a dedicated avenue to like surface it before it kind of blows up into something that like now people want to leave the group over it. And it just kind of, yeah, normalizes that discussion of like something a little tricky, a little sticky. Maybe we don't know how to bring it up, but if there's already a forum for it, it's like, okay, now it's that much easier. And we'll have some links at the end for there are examples of other groups that do this with something called a lemon squeeze or a rupture circle. Other groups call it tension shifting. So we'll drop the links to that at the very end. Another thing that could be helpful is just like reading aloud and listening. So maybe you have like 30 minutes where someone reads and everyone just listens, and then like 15 minutes for conversation. And this is separate from like an intensive study group, which can also be really helpful. But it's sometimes helpful just to have this like lower stakes, like practice like listening to someone read. It could be poetry, a novel, whatever it is, and I would encourage you to also think about doing this in a meeting or a gathering where everyone is there rather than in a like little working group, because then some people will like self-select into it and not everyone is there. If you just build it in, it can also be like a kind of sneaky way to like build in some anti-oppressive political education. That way everyone gets it, not only the people that already think it's really important, if you just have it at your monthly gathering or something. Poetry circles can be really helpful, where everyone has a chance to read, speak, and listen. Maybe you have a practice of a go around to kind of practice hearing from everyone, even the quietest voices. And poetry can also just be a really nice way to like talk about sensitive issues that might affect some people really deeply personally, but you can talk about it through the lens of someone else's words, someone else's narrative and poetry, and build that kind of empathy, consideration, reflection. Okay.
Yeah, so we want to turn it over to you. What are some other things that you've done or that you think would be a cool thing to do to prevent like preventative conflict practices that foster listening and care in your groups? So if you join us on slide 33, we'd love to hear what other things you would add to that list of how we can build stronger tissues, stronger threads of connection with one another so we can move through and prevent, hopefully, conflict, but also help us move through conflict when it comes up. Yeah, seeing so many great ideas in the stickies. Yeah, creating room, and so much of this is about making room outside of the work for relationship building, which is so key. Um, yeah, and people saying normalizing saying no, making time for gathering out without, quote unquote work or like, organizing work. Um, Meeting in parks, so like maybe changing up where you meet or going to places that bring people pleasure and enjoyment, like being outside. And yeah, the unstructured time, being more creative, sharing more about ourselves and being vulnerable, which again can be hard, but then also is just so key to building things together. And I really like at the beginning of meetings, like always like creating a culture of doing check-ins of like what's a capacity check, like a capacity check. So one being on a scale of 1 to 10, one being like, okay, I have so much room for stuff this week, and then 10 being like, oh, I'm actually at my limit. I can't take on any new tasks. That it sets up and then sharing back about why are you at, an 8 or a 9, like what's going on and do you feel comfy sharing a bit so that people are vulnerable at the top of the meeting, but then also you can get a sense of the room and the room's capacity right at the beginning about, okay, we're all a room of 9. So that means we probably should go a little easy on ourselves this week, right? What are some ways we can make this better, like meeting in a park or maybe shifting some things around? Yeah, so this is wonderful. Thanks everyone for sharing about how important it is to make space to be our full human selves in this work because we need to do that. There's a strategic imperative, but also a moral imperative. And I'm seeing in the chat, saying no to things and being trained by others to say no to things. Yeah, like what a beautiful gift, right? It might not seem like that at the time. Maybe you're like, oh, I want to say yes to everything, but then realizing actually it makes your yes much more meaningful. And also you're able to show up to your yeses better. Creating a safe environment for this work where people feel valued and respected is so key. Yeah, people are not going to keep showing up to a space where they don't feel that way. Understanding from the beginning what things would terminate group relationships and a promise for work. Yeah, for work with everything other than that. So yeah, making sure that you're clear on, yeah, what are some, things we don't want to create in our spaces and how can we kind of work back from that to make better spaces. Yeah, I'll pass to Amanda.
Great. Can move to the next slide. Yeah, okay. So this is another concept that comes from Kelly Hayes and Mariam Kaba, but also from the Ani Institute, which is a movement kind of support structure in Boston, and their namesake actually comes from the Quechua word for reciprocity. So I think it's a nice kind of reminder too that like a lot of this wisdom exists already in Indigenous and Black and POC communities, and so remembering that people who have not always had access to different like state or government forms of conflict resolution have come up with ways to do that already. But yeah, they both kind of in their own ways talk about this concept of seasonality and crisis mode. So oftentimes people like join a movement at the height of a protest or something. Maybe it was like the Shut Down Canada movement or what's happening right now in solidarity with Palestine. And it can be like super like high stress, but also very exciting, a lot of emotion. And if you're a new young organizer too, like I definitely have been in that place where I'm like, the revolution is tomorrow. Like it's imminent. I'm like, it's exciting. You're learning so many things. You're meeting so many people. There's so much happening. And then there's like a kind of dip in the valley. And sometimes I've seen this happen with like student groups I work with, is that sometimes we bring that energy from the moment we joined into our day-to-day organizing work, and it can create this kind of like artificial crisis or artificial, a lot of people spoke about urgency. There are moments that are truly urgent, and then there are moments where sometimes we're putting the pressure on ourselves for no reason. Like, is this deadline really a deadline or not? And, sometimes there are real deadlines, and sometimes we can actually be like, it's a little bit flexible. So thinking about seasons or dips and valleys in movement cycles, but also in leadership cycles. And Kelly Hayes and Mariam Kaba really encourage organizers to think about those dips or those low points as opportunities. It's, sometimes there's a tendency to be really disappointed after a big upsurge. But it can be an opportunity, like leverage those quieter moments to really develop the skills we've been talking about today, and use those skills in strategic and thoughtful ways the next time we're in a truly high pressure situation again. Um, and then the last thing I'll leave you with also comes from this wonderful Let This Radicalize You book, is kind of thinking about what they call comfort zones and stretch zones. So we all need space where we can operate completely within our comfort zone, or what they call like a sanctuary. The world we're living in is like really violent, and there's many systems of oppression, and they affect some of us more than others. And we all deserve and need some spaces of just true sanctuary where we can feel 100% seen and have 100% alignment and alignment of values. And I think it's important to know that like a lot of organizers, seasoned organizers, do create those spaces. That might be an affinity group just for queer people, or just for people of color, or just for disabled queer people, or whatever. It could be a caucus that's either within your organization or outside of your organization. Maybe it's like a close-knit political friendship group with people who align with you politically, but you're not in the same organization. You have that space where you feel completely seen and understood. And I think having that, I've come to learn that if I had had that sooner, it would have saved me a lot of heartache. But also thinking about in broad-based organizing, sometimes we need to move beyond our comfort zone and into what they call, Colleen Hayes and Mariame Kaba call a stretch zone. And this is going to be different for each person. I don't want to present this as like super prescriptive. Of course, we have like community agreements, norms. We try to create as much as possible. Oh, let's go back one sec. Thanks, Sarah. Or the next one. We try to do as much as possible to kind of set the stage for respect, but understanding that there are going to be some situations where we need to move a little bit beyond our stretch zone. We need to give space for someone to learn about something that is new to them from your experience that they didn't know about, and build that empathy. So that's when we get back to the slides.
Sorry, it's somehow been deleted. I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, the prompt was going to be, I'll just say it. If you have like a piece of paper.
This one.
Wonderful. Is to just think for a minute for yourself. Do you have a space currently where you feel like you can completely operate in your comfort zone? And if so, like what is it? And think about how you might need to turn to that in some moments. And if you don't, is there a way you can like find or create that or meet people? Yeah, take a and either journal to yourself, or if you want to put it in the chat, that's also fine.
All right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for sharing. Yeah, a lot of people sort of a few people who shared with us, and also I know some folks are writing at home alone. But kind of weaving quiet moments for self-reflection before a meeting or into your day can be a really beautiful thing to create that sort of space within yourself for that comfort zone. Um, yeah, finding out where and in what settings you can sort of, yeah, create some spaciousness for that comfort. So yeah, figuring out that might be alone, that might be with certain people, that might be in certain situations that you can try to build more into your life. Um, so yeah, as we round out today's workshop, we're just going to recap what we've gone over and then make a little bit of space for questions and for some follow up with like some folks have some conflict questions we'd love to chat about. So first, just to finish, we really want to really normalize the fact that conflict is a really important part of life and of organizing. We don't want to get rid of it. We want to get rid of preventable conflict by making sure we're not, recreating systems of oppression in our work and not listening to each other and not trying in good faith to repair when it's needed. But that it will come up. And so, how are we going to react accordingly and try to bring tools to bear on making sure that it is actually clarifying and actually helps us get closer to the things we want and the people we want to work with? But there are also lots of structures and practices we can put in place to minimize destructive conflict and prepare for the kinds of conflict, like I said, that can bring us to better places of clarity and alignment and a repair. And then finally, a lot of things that we can put in place in terms of structures are things around decision making, around the ways that we organize the work we do, and how we assess the work we do. How do we debrief? How do we weave kind of these self-reflective practices into the work we're doing so that we keep doing it better and that we also keep building relationships along the way. And yeah, finally, that maintaining a healthy group culture is sort of an ongoing process that is a shared responsibility. So it's something that we need to think about. How are we going to do that work together to maintain this kind of good working relationship with one another and the kind of working relationship we want other people to join us in? And that in heated conflict, we might not be our most, grounded selves, and we want to be thinking about what we want to do when we're in those moments, how we can, proactively build cultures of active listening, of talking about our feelings, so that once we're in those moments, we can have, some muscle memory, hopefully, to try to ground ourselves in those practices and values that are important to us. And then, very finally, be really aware of the dips and valleys of movements that even if it feels like everything's super urgent, that of course there are moments where that is true. And then there also are moments where we can try to make some spaciousness. And even in those moments of urgency as well, to have comfort and stretch zones so that we can prevent stress, prevent disappointment, and also cultivate sustainability, because we need to be humble in this work and realize that we're in this for the long run, that these structures around us that we're in conflict with are very strong, unfortunately, and that we need to be able to resource ourselves and each other as we do this work over the long term. So with that, yeah, I'd love to turn it over to the group. Are there questions people have about, we definitely surfaced a lot of conflicts that people have experienced at the very top of this workshop. What are some questions coming to your mind about what we've talked about today and about what's going on in your life? Maybe I'll stop sharing. I'll just stop recording so that we can have some privacy.